Hey everybody, and welcome to the headline here on Cheddar. I'm Dave Briggs. Stocks are trading in record territory. Inflation is cooling, interest rates are falling, and mortgage rates right along with them. The Federal Reserve appears to have executed the proverbial soft landing. Or have they? Steve Brennan is the head of private wealth solutions at Hamilton Lane. He joins us now from just outside Philly. Good to see you, Steve. So have they pulled it off, the soft landing?
Well, so far it would appear so. I think obviously the Fed rate cut was very well received by the market. We see that in public market returns recently. And so as we sit here today, it feels like inflation continues to cool. The Fed has really either met or exceeded expectations with the recent rate cut, and the market is happy with how we're sitting today.
So GDP growth exceeds expectation, about 3%. Unemployment is relatively low. What could really throw this equation off?
Well, certainly a couple of factors. You have geopolitical concerns out there as one, and then the other would certainly be the U.S. election that's coming up shortly. And so as we get through the U.S. election, I think that's at a point in time where we'll start to be able to assess the stability of the market and whether we're going to see an increase in deal activity as we go forward to go along with the rate cuts and the easing of inflation.
On that note, how could the election change the equation?
Yeah, it's hard to say at this point. I think our view has been that from both candidates, you've seen a lot of talk and not a lot of detail in terms of their policies. And so for us, Hamilton Lane, we're a private markets investment firm. We think that our clients invested in the private markets will not really be significantly impacted by the outcome of the election, given the long-term nature of our asset class. But there will certainly be some short-term fluctuations in the public markets.
I do want to return to the Hamilton Lane model in private markets. Will the public markets see an impact of the election, in your opinion?
Yeah, they certainly will, undoubtedly. I think the public markets will see those short-term market fluctuations. And then over time, the market will stabilize when we get certainty into what the new political regime will be and what their policies are likely to be as they start to enact new policies.
It would be nice if either candidate learned from what got us into this mess, massive government spending. I think we can forget about that. There is no mention of that, no mention of deficit or debts, and we shouldn't expect that either. So one final question about the Fed, that's that next meeting just after the election. What's your expectation there?
Yeah, I think the Fed has signaled that we're going to continue to see rate cuts going forward on a more gradual basis. So I think directionally we know where we're headed. I think everyone feels quite good about that. The question is just how frequent and how much those cuts will be.
And what sectors will that lower interest rate environment impact positively or negatively?
Yeah, I think for Hamilton Lane, as private equity investors, for example, it'll certainly impact the private equity market quite positively. I think we are seeing a lower cost of capital that will allow a lot of the money that's been sitting on the sidelines for the past year or so to come back into the market in the form of new deals getting done. It'll also increase the exit activity coming out of private markets as you're going to see more of an alignment between buyers and sellers.
Steve, why do you think so much of that money is still on the sidelines?
Yeah, I think it's because we've been in a high interest rate environment for a prolonged period of time, and there's been a misalignment between sellers' expectations and what buyers are willing to pay for an asset, because when they look to finance those assets, they obviously need to borrow capital. And that cost of capital has been quite high. And so now we're seeing those rates come down. We're starting to see the cost of capital come down. And I think that will spur buyers to come more and more off the sidelines. And we're already seeing an increase in deal activity.
Plenty of money coming off the sidelines into OpenAI, who's raising money from Apple, from NVIDIA, from Microsoft, just to mention a few. And now a new valuation of $150 billion, and companies aren't even recognizing profits yet in the AI sector. What does that story mean to you?
Yeah, I think for us as private equity investors at Hamilton Lane, it means that the private equity asset class generally has grown significantly. 10 years ago, you could never see a company like OpenAI raise a $150 billion valuation in the private markets. They would have had to go public in order to achieve that type of valuation. The private markets have grown significantly. Companies are staying private far longer today than they ever have before. And the private equity asset class has grown to be able to support that. To give you an example, 30 years ago, there were 40% more public companies in the United States than there are today. So the number of public companies has dropped pretty significantly. Companies are staying private far longer. The opportunity set for investors in the private markets is bigger than ever before.
Why are companies staying private longer, and is there less incentive to go public today than 10 years ago?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. There is less incentive. I think there's questions around regulation and just the cost and the administration of being a public company. And then the other part of this is that the corporate governance model in private equity simply works. In private equity, when you buy a company, you have majority control of that business. You have the ability to hire and fire the management. You have the ability to appoint the board of directors. You have the ability to impact the strategic direction of the company in a way that's much more long-term thinking without managing to quarterly earnings expectations. And I think people have found that you can add a whole lot of value to businesses in that type of a governance structure.
So what is your advice to the average investor in this environment, given all that we just laid out?
Yeah, I would say to make sure that you consider the opportunity set available in the private markets. If you think about the private markets today, in the United States, of all the companies that have over $100 million in revenue, 87% of those companies are private today. And so if you want to get exposure to the full spectrum of the capital markets, you really need access into the private equity market or the private infrastructure market, private credit. Hamilton Lane's at the forefront of that space today, and I think more and more options are becoming available to allow individual investors to access the private markets.
That's terrific news. Our thanks to Steve Brennan, head of Private Wealth Solutions at Hamilton Lane. Good to see you, sir. Thanks so much. Earlier this week, my colleague Diane King Hall spoke with Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm right here on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange to discuss the future of clean energy in the next administration, be it the Trump or Harris administration. Take a look.
Earlier, you talked about the progress that has happened under the Biden administration with regard to clean energy goals. Former President Trump has indicated amid his campaign plans to kind of pull back investment in clean energy, climate initiatives. What does that signal for the road ahead for clean energy and climate progress?
Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, we know that the Inflation Reduction Act and its incentives last for 10 years. You would need an act of Congress to carve that back, right? 18 Republicans sent a letter this past week saying, we do not want this carved back because actually a vast majority of the funding has gone to red states and red counties. And it would be political malpractice to pull up factories that are hiring people in Republican districts to be able to satisfy what the Trump plan is. So I'm pretty confident that this will continue because it will mean it has such bipartisan support right now. In fact, in the polls, vast bipartisan majorities support the Inflation Reduction Act. They want to see these manufacturing jobs in the United States. They want to see clean energy produced in the United States. Why would we deny ourselves the opportunity to compete with China and bring that manufacturing and the ability for energy security to be here? It would be foolish to undo it.
And if, obviously we're in the middle of an election season, would you see yourself staying on under a Harris-Walz administration?
Well, that's a conversation I'd have to have with her.
Okay, all right. And then what do you see as your legacy so far?
Honestly, I feel like I am the luckiest energy secretary in the history of the country because we're in this history-making moment. An unbelievable expansion of deployment of clean energy on our grid, an unbelievable amount of manufacturing these clean energy products in America. I say this as the former governor of Michigan, and when we were in a period where we saw all of these jobs leave, all this offshoring, all this outsourcing, and leaving communities behind, and now we've flipped the script on that. And that means that all of this manufacturing coming back is benefiting those communities that had been forgotten. 86% of the investments are going to communities with below average weekly wages or with below average college graduation rates. Those communities, we're healing the country. We're giving communities the opportunity to participate in this incredible energy economy, and it's very exciting. And I feel very lucky to have been energy secretary while all this is happening.
New York City Mayor Eric Adams indicted. So what do we do now? What are the political implications? More Cheddar after the break.
As the indictment alleges, Mayor Adams engaged in a long-running conspiracy in which he solicited and knowingly accepted illegal campaign contributions from foreign donors and corporations.
That was U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Damian Williams, speaking on the indictment of New York City Mayor Eric Adams on federal corruption charges, including bribery and wire fraud. Federal investigators have searched Adams' home while the mayor continues to maintain his innocence and says he will not resign. So what's the collateral damage here with less than 40 days until the presidential election? Erin Doherty is a politics reporter for Axios, and she joins us now. Erin, nice to see you. So if I'm the Trump campaign, I'm certainly going to tie this case directly to the Democratic Party. Is that your expectation? Will it stick?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we can expect former President Trump, who actually has a route, who just announced a press conference in New York City later today, that he is going to sort of use this to paint the Democratic Party as sort of chaotic and a mess. And I do think that there's no question that, at least in New York City politics, this sort of massive bombshell does inject a level of chaos into New York City politics ahead of this contentious election. And of course, we've seen that New York City Mayor Eric Adams has faced calls to step aside. And so in the days ahead, it'll be interesting to see if those calls continue to grow and if eventually they become untenable for him to continue serving as the city's mayor.
This is, of course, Trump's hometown, and it would not surprise anyone if they tie this to the party. But given the president's own legal challenges and numerous indictments, isn't that a difficult needle to thread?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen former President Trump sort of do this, kind of navigate this balancing act in the past, where he is, of course, the first former United States president to ever become a convicted felon, but he has still sort of cast the Democratic Party as corrupt and as sort of law-breaking under some instances. So I think it's not necessarily surprising if former President Trump does sort of use this as ammo to cast the Democratic Party, at least in New York City, as corrupt. And I think that former President Trump, for his part, he has totally dismissed the charges against him and has, kind of like Adams, maintained has denied wrongdoing in the charges. And so I think that we can expect in his press conference today that he will lean heavily into this Eric Adams revelation.
It's very much a Trumpian defense that Eric Adams is taking here. It's all political corruption aimed at taking me down. Let's move on to the race. Less than 40 days. Where do we stand right now coming out of what appears to be the only debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump? Does it remain neck and neck?
Yeah, it is incredibly close at this point, and it could end up being the closest presidential election in modern U.S. history. And so we're seeing both candidates really crisscross the country to these sort of 7 battleground states that are expected to decide the election in November. The sort of next big event on the political calendar is the vice presidential debate scheduled for next Tuesday. And what sort of could be remarkable about that is that it could be the last time that these sort of tickets are on stage ahead of a national audience, because, as you mentioned, it seems unlikely that there will be another presidential debate. So it's possible that Senator J.D. Vance and Governor Tim Walz sort of have the final say for their tickets ahead of this national audience. Of course, former President Trump and Vice President Harris are going to be having rallies in the days ahead, sort of constantly, but this could be the last sort of time on national TV that we see these tickets on full display.
With the notable exception of Sarah Palin, though, do we ever see a vice presidential choice or debate actually move the needle?
Yeah, it seems like the vice presidential debate is unlikely going to it's not likely to have a fundamental impact on the dynamics of the race. But I do think that these are both sort of, especially in Tim Walz's case, sort of newcomers to the national political scene. And so I think that it'll be a sort of test to see how they can message on their party platform. And in this razor thin race, I do think that it sort of increases the odds because these running mates do not want to mess up anything for their candidate with, just less than a month to go before the election.
And though the Americans, I think, would be beneficial for having one more presidential debate, it looks like that's off the table. Brett Baer from Fox News confirmed that it's not Kamala Harris balking at a Fox News debate. It is, in fact, the Trump campaign. Are you ruling out another debate between the two?
Of course, with former President Trump, anything can change at this point, but he indicated in North Carolina at his rally on Saturday that he thinks it's sort of too late in the process to have a late October presidential debate. So it seems unlikely that there will be another one, and I think it seems pretty clear that the strategy from the Trump campaign and now the Harris campaign too for her part is to sort of rely on these targeted media engagements with people to try to appeal directly to voters in these key swing states to try to win them over in the final days before the election.
So is there one issue, is there one state that you believe will decide this election in the final 38 days?
I think between the key battlegrounds, it's sort of a toss-up, and we've seen that both of these candidates have targeted these battlegrounds, specifically Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan, and now we've sort of seen North Carolina come onto the map a lot more after sort of the bombshell revelations regarding Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, who is running for governor, and former President Trump has endorsed for his race. But so I think between the battlegrounds, it really is going to come down to a few margins in these key swing states, and both campaigns at this point are trying to make sure that they leave no voter sort of unreached in these key battlegrounds because again, it's going to be razor thin, and I think both campaigns know that.
We've heard very few specifics from Kamala Harris regarding her plans for the economy or frankly any issue. She did give an interview to MSNBC last night. What did we learn?
Yeah, so it was she sat down with MSNBC, and it sort of was a continuation of what we heard in her speech earlier in the day, centered on her economic platform. And there were some questions that sort of tried to get into the specifics, but she sort of answered broadly about sort of her economic vision, which is a thing that we've seen on the campaign trail from her in the past and throughout her campaign, which is, of course, much abbreviated. But she sort of tends to have a broader vision of her policy platform rather than diving into the specifics. And we saw that again last night with her MSNBC interview.
Yeah, she did lay out her three principles as the economy: housing, help for first-time homebuyers, a child tax plan that involves expanding credits to families, and finally a plan to boost small businesses with tax deductions. That's going to cost an awful lot of money. Some argue nowhere near as much money as the Trump campaign would spend or would expand the deficit. What is the Trump economic plan centered on?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of has been a similar platform that we've seen throughout his campaign, but he has sort of been a little bit wishy-washy and has, argued that that he sort of wants to help all Americans, and a lot of his economic plan sort of pins on, blaming the Biden-Harris administration for some of the economic conditions that Americans are facing today. So he is sort of blaming the Biden administration for these sort of some economic pains that Americans feel, to sort of argue that he should be elected because he would make the economy better for some Americans. And of course, the Harris campaign refutes that, and they blame the Trump campaign for some of the economic conditions that Americans are facing. So that sort of has been an underlying theme throughout this race that I expect we'll continue to see heading into November.
Yeah, her economic plans all hinge on having the votes from Congress, and it looks like a divided government if at best. It looks like the Republican Party holds the Senate. Maybe the Democrats hold the House, which makes all this null and void. He wants to center everything on tariffs. Is that something he can do himself, or does he need congressional approval?
So there's sort of a debate about that, but I think he would need congressional approval. And I think that, again, a lot of these sort of policy proposals that the Trump campaign has put out kind of does hinge on congressional approval. So, and same with the Harris campaign for her part. And so I think that going forward, some of these plans that both candidates have outlined do sort of have the caveat of them needing to pass Congress.
So ultimately, this could come down, like a lot of elections, to personality, who you like, who you trust. Should be an interesting final 38 days. Our thanks to Aaron Doherty, politics reporter for Axios. Thanks so much. Coming up, the business news you may have missed this week, including the DOJ suing Visa for allegedly monopolizing the debit card market. Stick around. Welcome back to Cheddar. Here are the top business stories you may have missed this week. The Justice Department is suing Visa for allegedly monopolizing the debit card market. The DOJ claims the company forces businesses to use its network and blocks competition. The DOJ says this leads to higher fees that are passed on to consumers, increasing prices. Visa denies the allegations, stating it faces growing competition. The lawsuit is part of a broader antitrust effort by the DOJ, which has also targeted companies like Google and Ticketmaster. Best and final. Boeing is making a new offer to workers to try and put a lid on a nearly 2-week strike. The plane manufacturer is raising its offer to the International Association of Machinists Union, now proposing a 30% raise over 4 years, including an immediate 12% increase and a $6,000 signing bonus. This comes after workers rejected an earlier offer, prompting the strike that has virtually grounded jet production. The new offer does not restore the traditional pension plan. The union criticized Boeing for announcing the offer without further talks and said members would not vote on it by the September 27th deadline, deeming it insufficient to end the strike. TikTok has unfollowed accounts tied to Russian media outlets for violating its guidelines by attempting to covert influence ahead of the 2024 U.S. election. This follows Meta's recent ban on the same entities for foreign interference. The U.S. Justice Department also charged some Russian media employees for funneling nearly $10 million into a U.S. company to promote pro-Russian content aimed at influencing American voters. Kmart is closing its last full-size store in the U.S. mainland on October 20th in Bridgehampton, New York. This marks the end of an iconic era for the retailer. Once part of a massive 2005 merger with Sears, Kmart struggled to compete with Walmart, Target, and online shopping. After the merger, the focus shifted to selling off assets, leading to bankruptcy and the closure of nearly all stores. Now Kmart has only a few remaining locations in Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and a small convenience store in Miami. Levi Jeans is teasing a potential collaboration with Beyonce in an Instagram post featuring an image of a woman on horseback captioned, "Introducing a new chapter." This comes after the release of Beyonce's country album, which includes the song Levi's Jeans. Despite missing sales expectations in its second quarter earnings, Levi's leadership remains positive about the growth of denim in the future, highlighting a revival in popularity for various denim items. The post generated excitement among fans and led to a brief rise in shares of Levi's. That's going to do it for us this week. Thanks for watching. More Cheddar up next.